They came from distant courts, believing they already understood the world. Envoys, traders, and friars sent east across thousands of miles to a people the settled kingdoms dismissed as savages who lived in tents. Picture one of them, a Franciscan friar from the west, riding out onto the open Mongolian steppe as the first hard cold of the season closed in around him, certain in his heart that these wandering herders could not possibly survive what was coming, and what was coming was almost beyond imagining. Out here the temperature falls to 50 degrees below zero, a cold so violent that bare skin can freeze in under 2 minutes, where water turns to ice an arm's length from the fire, and steel itself grows brittle and cracks in the dark. This is not winter as most of us know it, a season of inconvenience. This is winter as an enemy, and not a mindless one, but something that behaves almost like a living intelligence, patient enough to wait, and clever enough to find the single weakness a man forgot to guard. To the traveller, the answer looked obvious. Life should not be able to exist out here at all, and these people in their fragile circles of felt would surely be the proof. He was certain the flimsy tent beside him would collapse before morning, certain the whole camp would be dead long before the first grass of spring. He had come to pity them. By spring he would be the one who did not understand the world, because what he was about to witness across that endless winter was not desperation and not luck, but a system so precise, so ruthlessly intelligent, that it would not only keep every soul in that camp alive, it would one day help these very people make the mightiest empires on earth tremble. The secret began with the very thing he had mistaken for a simple tent. The friar looked at the round, felt dwelling and saw something crude, and in that judgment he was already wrong, because almost nothing about it was accidental. He was used to buildings with corners, and corners were exactly the floor, the dead pockets where cold air pools and frost begins to crawl inward, and this home the Mongols called a ger had done away with them entirely. Its curved walls turned the wind aside instead of catching it, and the warmth inside circled endlessly around the central fire, rather than dying in some frozen angle of the room. What he took for flimsiness was the second surprise, because the wooden lattice frame beneath the felt, the khana, was built to flex on purpose. And out here that was genius, since rigid things grow brittle in this cold and snap, while the ger bent under the weight of snow and wind, and let that force travel around its circular body like pressure through the spokes of a wheel. Over that frame lay the felt, layer upon layer of compressed sheep's wool, trapping countless tiny pockets of air in the very same way a modern insulated coat does today. But the detail he could never have guessed was moisture, the assassin no traveller sees coming, because at 50 below, every breath, every pot of soup, every sleeping body breathes invisible vapour into the air, and in a truly sealed shelter that vapour freezes to the walls as a creeping shell of ice that steals heat faster than any fire can give it back. The felt let that vapour escape before it could turn to frost, and on this steppe, staying dry, was the thin line between the living and the dead. Even the doorway obeyed a logic he only slowly understood, opening almost always to the south, turned deliberately away from the killing winds that poured down out of Siberia, with a heavy felt flap that worked like an airlock, while the fire's steady updraft pulled fresh air in low and pushed smoke up and out through the open crown of the roof, the tonneau, high above. And then came the revelation that unsettled him most of all. This was not a house at all in the way he understood the word. It was a machine that could be taken apart, folded and carried, raised again in a single hour on a new horizon, a home that could vanish from one plane and reappear on another, as if the people themselves could not be pinned to the earth. But the traveller knew that the finest shelter on earth becomes a tomb the moment its fire dies, and here he expected these people to fail completely, because he could see it with his own eyes. There were no trees, no forests to fell, no wood piles, none of the fuel his own world was built upon, and yet the fire burned, night after night, fed by the one thing the land gave without end, dung. Dried horse, cattle, yak and sheep dung, called argol, gathered patiently all summer and stacked in sheltered heaps before the freeze. To him it looked like poverty. It was closer to genius, because that dried dung was something extraordinary in disguise. All summer the grass had drunk in sunlight, the animals had eaten the grass and turned it into flesh and waste, and that waste had dried hard beneath the steppe sun into fuel, so that on the coldest night of the year these families were quite literally burning the captured sunlight of a vanished summer, months after the grass itself had disappeared beneath the snow. It burned slow and steady, hot enough to melt snow into water and turn strips of hardened meat back into soup, and that meat was its own quiet marvel. They called it borts, lean strips hung in the freezing air until they were light as paper and hard as wood, meat a rider could carry for weeks in a saddlebag and drop into boiling water to bloom into a rich broth, using almost no fuel at all. Around it they built a diet the friar found strange, and could not argue with fat, marrow and butter as dense burning calories for a body fighting the cold, organ meats for the vitamins, muscle alone could not give, and nothing wasted. As blood became sausage and bone became broth and milk became butter and curds, and slowly a deeper truth began to trouble him. Back home, to survive a winter, his people needed granaries, mills, supply roads, whole chains of labour stretching for miles. These herders carried the entire season in a saddlebag, and a darker thought followed close behind it, one that would haunt the settled world for generations. You can burn a city's granaries and starve it into surrender in a single season, but how do you burn a herd of animals that simply walks away? These were not people you could lay siege to, and that was only the beginning of what made them impossible to defeat. To understand why, the friar had to see what he had been looking at wrong the entire time. Back home, animals were property, wealth to be counted. Out here, the herd was something his language barely had a word for. It was infrastructure, transportation, food, fuel, clothing, and a warning system, all of it walking beside the people on 4 legs. The horses swept the snow aside with their hooves to reach the frozen grass beneath, surviving where the softer foreign breeds he knew would simply have died. When the storms came, the animals were gathered upwind of the camp, until their massed bodies became a living wall against the gale. Dozens of them clustered together, throwing off real, measurable heat. The sheep gave the wool that became the very felt of the gear, and in the harsh mounting cold the yak gave milk so rich in fat that ordinary cattle could never have matched it. Even the animal's behaviour was a kind of instrument, for the steppe had no gauges and no glass, so the people learned to read the herd instead, a horse turning its back to the wind, or the sheep refusing to graze, warning of a storm still hours from arriving. And against the slow killer of a meat-bound winter, the sickness that had wiped out entire crews of sailors' scurvy, that bleeding of the gums and loosening of the teeth they had airag, mare's milk fermented into a mildly sour, faintly alcoholic drink, carrying the living cultures and the trace of vitamin C that held that darkness back through half a year without a single green plant. But the deepest thing the traveller finally grasped was this: the herd did not merely feed them, the herd moved them. Season after season the people flowed across the land between one pasture and the next, never defending a fixed patch of ground, but passing through it like water, following the grass wherever it grew. And that was the revelation that turned his pity into something closer to fear. His own world was rooted to its cities, tied to its fields, anchored to walls that could be surrounded. But a civilization whose homes, whose fire, whose food, and whose roads all walked together could never be besieged, never be starved out, never be pinned in place and destroyed. The very system that had beaten the cruelest winter on earth would, in time, prove just as merciless against any human army foolish enough to stand in its path. The enemy the Mongols had truly conquered was not out there on the battlefield at all, because the real enemy of a steppe winter was never the cold at all. It was despair, the slow erosion of the will to rise in the dark and do the same hard things one more time, and this the friar had never been taught to fight. He watched these people answer it with something quieter than courage, as discipline became warmth, and routine became safety, and the closeness of the community became the insulation that kept hopelessness from freezing a family from the inside out. He had arrived believing they fought against nature. Slowly he understood they had done something stranger and wiser. They had not conquered the land at all. They had learned to fit inside it until the felt, the fire, the herd, and the human hands that tended all three became a single living system where everything depended on everything else, and no part could be removed without collapsing the whole. And then the spring he had been so sure would never come for them arrived. The grass broke green through the melting snow, and the camp he had quietly expected to bury was not merely alive. It was already gone folded, loaded, and moving, flowing north with the season toward fresh pasture, exactly as these people had done for 1,000 years before he ever rode out to pity them. He had come to teach them about the world. He left understanding that he had been the one who never truly knew it, and here at last is the secret the settled world would learn to fear. A people who could defeat the cruelest enemy on earth, a winter that killed steel and froze the breath in your chest, did not tremble before any army made merely of men. The very genius that beat 50 below would one day carry them across continents, and the kingdoms behind their stone walls would learn that the herders in the tents were the most dangerous force the world had ever seen. We look back and call their life primitive, but they had understood something we have half forgotten. A city rooted to the ground can be surrounded, starved, and broken, and we call those walls safety. They could lose a battle, a pasture, an entire season, and simply move on and begin again, and they called that freedom. We built walls and named it security. They built the wheel and named it survival. If the hidden brilliance buried inside how our ancestors truly lived stays with you the way it stays with me, then follow along, because history is stranger, harsher, and far more ingenious than we were ever taught.